very much. Okay.
Thank you very much. So for those that don't know me, firstly, I'm recovering from a cold, so we'll see how long this voice lasts. Secondly, my name's Jonny Garrett. I'm a filmmaker and an author, almost exclusively in the beer space. The main thing that I do is I produce videos for YouTube, for something called the Craft Beer Channel. If you've ever watched beer content on YouTube, you've probably seen that it's mostly based around people sat in bedrooms, kitchens, or something like that, just reviewing beer. That's very much not the take that we have, and from the time that we started it, which is almost 10 years ago now, we've been out and exploring the world, going to breweries, going to pubs, speaking to the people that are producing it, speaking to the people that are drinking it, and increasingly speaking to academics, historians, and stuff like that. Now, the beer that's just being poured at the moment was the result of a documentary that was released in September, a feature-length documentary, 90 minutes of nerding out about IPA, which we collaborated with Meantime Brewing on. And the idea for this beer that you're about to taste and for the documentary that we made came from a tasting that I was doing. I went to the Fuller's Vintage Ale tasting last year, so 2021. And I was sat there at the tasting, and I was sat opposite Paul Cobbett, the MD of Charles Farram, the hop supplier and indeed hop grower and breeder here in the UK. And he just said, fairly offhand to me, he just said the British hop farming is in crisis. And I was like, all right, Paul, we're drinking 8% beer. Tell me more about that. And he said, well, there's only 57 farms left. From a peak of 70,000 acres in the 1860s, we now have just under 2,000 acres of hop growing in the UK now. He said it's still declining by double digits every year. And I said, so what are we doing about that? And it turns out not a huge amount, to be honest. British hops have suffered from many, many different things. The main issue is the declining cask, which is, well, we all know about the decline of cask because, that's almost why we're here. It's something that we're incredibly passionate about. But the decline of that is having a huge knock-on effect on the amount of British hops being grown, because British hops generally are used in these traditional British styles on cask. I might go around with a tray and start handing these out.
I'll do that.
Are you sure? Oh, thank you.
Anybody want to volunteer to help me?
So I went away from this tasting previously having no idea of the struggle. I'd always considered cask being the main issue here, the thing that we need to protect. I've been a member of CAMRA for years. I was, in fact, at that tasting filming a documentary about the decline of cask, which came out last year. And I went away with just this idea of what do we need to do to stop the decline of the British hop industry. And then in December, I got a call from Asahi, who own Fuller's and own Meantime, saying that they were relaunching Meantime. So they bought it as part of the deal, in which they also got Pilsner Urquell and Grolsch. I don't know why you'd buy Grolsch, but they did. And they basically said to us, we want to relaunch it. We want to be back in beer drinkers' minds. We want to show that we're serious about Meantime as a craft brewery, but also as a British brewery. So can you come up with a concept that could help us relaunch this brand? Meantime is a brewery that when I lived in London in sort of the sort of 2010s, was a big fan of. Yakima Red was a great keg beer. But I hadn't thought about them for about 10 years. So I went away thinking, I'm probably not going to do that with you, to be honest. And then I remembered this conversation that I had with Paul Cobbett. And I thought, well, they want to be known as a British brewery. They want to hammer home this, we're from London. Meantime is our name. Maybe they should join this campaign to help save British hops. So I went back to them and I said, what I want to do is brew an English IPA. Now, if you know anything about the decline of English IPA in this country as a style, you'll know that that was not particularly greeted with much enthusiasm. American IPAs have entirely dominated that hop-forward kind of category in the last 10 to 15 years in this country, and the last nearly 30 years over in the States. But we explained the idea. We explained how there were only 2,000 acres of British hops being grown now in the UK. We explained the incredible amount of heritage that will be lost should British hops just become, this strange little niche where people are like, oh, this is actually British hopped, and all the incredible beers that we would potentially lose if all of these farmers start shutting up shop. And they were up for it. They were like, okay, we understand what we're going to be doing here. Lots of their beers are already exclusively British hopped anyway, except for their session IPA wasn't. Everything else is. And of course, they have this heritage. If you remember back in the 2000s when they first opened with Alistair Hook, the two beers that they came out with was a London Porter and a London IPA, both of which were great, came in beautiful bottles, were doing exactly what they should have been doing for classic British brewing for modern drinkers. So yeah, they gave us the funding. We started making this documentary, and Brad, my partner on the channel, and I started traveling around the UK, trying to recreate the English IPA, but with a modern twist that would get modern drinkers excited about this style. So the first thing we did was we went to the hop farms. We went to a hop farm not far away from Charles Fareham, where we met the lovely Sarah, who's been growing there. The farm's been going for absolutely decades, but she's been there for about 15 years. During that interview, to camera, smugly, because I'd done my research, I was like, and I believe there's only 57 hop farms left, to which Will, who was from Charles Fareham, said, actually it's 53, 4 have closed since you had that conversation. So we were down to 53 farms, one of which was Sarah's, not a huge farm, but still one of the biggest ones in the UK. And while we were there, we chatted about the hops, about the heritage, about the uniqueness of British hops. We also came to Burton. We came to the Brewing Museum. I've skipped the fact that we started off with Martin Cornell. Nobody forgets Martin Cornell. He won't let you. So we actually started by chatting to Martin Cornell about the history of IPA, about these original recipes. So much like you guys were doing in looking back at the original Allsops, we looked through the brewing records. We chatted to Martin about what perhaps these flavors could be. So we looked at some more kind of qualitative text as to what people described the beer tasting like, or looking like, and came up with what we hoped was going to be a kind of blueprint for a new style that got people excited. So then we went to the hop farm. Then we went to the maltings. We went to Crisp, where Crisp Maltings in Norfolk, where they've just a couple of years ago reintroduced lots of heritage malts. So there we got to go to a Chevalier field. Chevalier was the dominant malt, certainly through most of the 1800s, and would have been used in many of these IPAs. So we decided to use Chevalier malt in there. We decided to use Goldings hops, which were most likely the hops that were being used, although back then they didn't know they were Goldings. They were just East Kent hops. We then came here to Burton. We went to the Brewing Museum. We learned all about the Burton Snatch, about gypsum. So we decided that whatever beer we did would have to have that Burtonized water profile. And then we went to the National Collection of Yeast Cultures in Norwich, and dug out of cold storage a yeast that was being used way back in the 1800s to brew IPAs. And we believe, although they can't tell you exactly, we believe it was the precursor to London Ale 3, which I think is the yeast that's used in David's beer. So after all of those visits, after learning about all of these incredible ingredients, we then sat down and came up with what we now call the British IPA. So we are trying to produce a new style of IPA that combines all of the inspiration from the 1800s, but then modernizes it to make a beer that might be recognizable to people who love American IPAs. So Burtonized water profile, it's 50% Chevalier malt, 50% Golden Promise from Scotland. That's as much of the British element as we could really bring in. Welsh hops, even more rare than English hops. We then used London Ale 3, the original London Ale 3, I think possibly the Whitbread strain, but again, they weren't quite tell us. And then Burtonized the water using gypsum. The modern twist, the way that we tried to make this as modern as we could, is we used modern British varieties. So the British hop farming industry has got itself into real difficulty by just being a little bit too slow to react to what was going on in America. So, Cascade was created, crossbred in the 1950s, became popular in the 1980s with Sierra Nevada and Anchor Brewing. And by the 90s, they'd switched from just producing breeding hops for bitterness, for efficiency, so as higher alpha as you can get, as lower flavor as you can get, so you can use as few hops as possible in the boil. They switched to producing aroma hops as much as possible. And indeed, it was about 2010 when they started producing more aroma hops than they did bittering hops in the States. The year before that is when Charles Fareham started their breeding program. Crossbreeding hops, experimenting with them, brewing with them, releasing it in volume into the market takes about 10 years. So that's why in about 2019, 2020, we're starting to see new British hop varieties coming out that are focusing on aroma. So while we were at this farm with Charles Fareham, we tried 4 brand new hop varieties and one relatively old one, which is Jester, which came out sort of in the mid 2015-ish, I think. So in this beer, we have Jester. Jester was then crossbred, and we ended up with a hop called Olicana, which is also in this beer, and then Olicana was crossbred again, and we ended up with the final hop in this beer, which is Harlequin. So it's golden throughout the boil, and then once we get to the whirlpool and to the dry hop, it's all modern British hop varieties. So hopefully what you've ended up with is an extremely dry beer, because classic IPAs would have been dry. It's all Chevalier character, so there's definitely some kind of fruit and biscuit notes, kind of squash fly biscuit notes, I think, coming from... Garibaldi, is that the name for a squash fly biscuit? Then we've got 45 IBUs, so just a bit shy of the Allsops one. But because this was in can, but it's a keg beer, so it's, with the higher carbonation, it's going to present slightly more bitter, and with the Burtonization, it's obviously going to present more bitter as well, because we know that's what gypsum does. But then hopefully on the nose, you're picking up fairly subtle. More kind of what modern drinkers would call juicy. So there might be touches of mango, there might be touches of grapefruit and of citrus and of pine, which hopefully we think is really nicely balanced with the malt character. The whole idea behind this was because the future of British hop farming is relying on these modern hops. We have to accept that while Cask Ale desperately needs help, while Cask Ale desperately deserves our help, the best way that we can actually help them is to ensure that those heritage varieties survive. And the best way to do that is to innovate in the British hop industry and to get these new varieties being grown in great scale and used in modern style, American style IPAs as well. Because once you close a hop farm, it's incredibly difficult and incredibly expensive to start it up again. So those 4 that closed last year will not be opening again in my lifetime. You know, it's hundreds and hundreds of thousands of pounds to process hops. It's 3 to 4 years to actually get a crop. So who's going to be tearing out much profitable crops to wait 4 years, spend £1 million on processing equipment, and then make a small profit selling to cask ale brewers? It's just not a sustainable model anymore. So it feels very weird to me as a cask ale lover, as a former camera member. I didn't renew last year because I'm an idiot. To be saying that we need to be championing these more modern styles to make sure that our heritage continues to survive, but it's definitely one way that we can do it. I don't think I took a breath during that, so apologies. I'd love to hear what you think of the beer. I'll be at the Cooper's Tavern. If you've got any questions about the project or about the beer now, I'll happily answer them once I've grabbed one. It's called Now IPA. Now. So it's 5.2. So the thing I didn't quite mention is that the other thing that we wanted to do is we wanted to make it, from a flavour standpoint, possible to do on cask. And I've been nudging Asahi going, hey, Darkstar, who they also own, should probably do a cask version of this. We also wanted it to be pintable. The pint is the national dish, so we didn't want to brew something as strong as the old traditional IPAs, because we wanted people to enjoy this by the pint. The documentary, by the way, is called The Time Is Now. So if you put that onto YouTube, scroll past Moloko, who have a very famous song called that, you'll find our documentary, or just put the Craft Beer channel in to YouTube. Thank you very much.